that are ever going to happen, but I'm really happy to be here. I'm always happy to be at this event because the Golden Globe has always meant a great deal to me.
For more than half a century, Faye Dunaway stood as one of the most formidable and unforgettable figures in the history of cinema. A woman whose icy elegance, razor-sharp intelligence, and fearless intensity redefined what it meant to be a leading lady. She was not merely beautiful, she was commanding. Not simply talented, she was dangerous in her brilliance. From the late 1960s through the 1970s, Faye Dunaway ruled the screen with an authority few actresses before or after her could match. Audiences watched in awe as she transformed into characters who were ruthless, seductive, ambitious, and emotionally complex, women who did not ask for permission to dominate the story. To the public, she was cinema royalty, an icon of sophistication and power whose name alone carried prestige. Yet behind the shimmering legacy of awards, applause, and timeless performances existed a far more painful reality, one marked by emotional turmoil, public misunderstanding, professional exile, and a relentless inner struggle that no amount of fame could silence. For every standing ovation Faye Dunaway received, there was a quiet cost that followed her home. As her reputation for excellence grew, so did whispers of difficulty, isolation, and emotional volatility. Over time, admiration gave way to controversy, and praise was replaced by headlines that painted her as demanding, impossible, and difficult to work with. What the world celebrated as strength on screen became, off-screen, a source of punishment. The same intensity that made her unforgettable became the very trait that pushed her to the margins of an industry that once worshipped her. Fame, which had elevated her into cinematic immortality, slowly turned into a magnifying glass that exposed every flaw, every misstep, and every moment of vulnerability. Her name, once synonymous with artistic prestige, became tangled in narratives of decline, conflict, and misunderstood behavior. This is the cruel paradox at the heart of Faye Dunaway's life. She achieved what countless actors only dream of: cultural immortality, artistic respect, and a permanent place in film history. Yet she paid for that success with loneliness, emotional strain, and a career that burned out long before her talent ever did. While audiences remembered her as Bonnie Parker, as Evelyn Mulwray, as Diana Christensen, the woman herself was navigating a world that increasingly had no space for complexity, mental fragility, or uncompromising artistic standards. The applause faded, but the expectations never did. The industry moved on, but the weight of her legacy remained, pressing heavily on a woman who had given everything to her craft. This is not a story meant to glorify stardom or romanticize suffering. It is an examination of the hidden toll that greatness can exact, especially on women who refuse to soften themselves to be more palatable. Faye Dunaway's journey forces us to confront uncomfortable truths about fame, power, and the price of intensity. It reveals how quickly admiration can turn into abandonment, how easily strength can be misinterpreted as hostility, and how brilliance is often celebrated only as long as it remains convenient. Beneath the polished images and legendary performances lies a human story filled with contradiction, pain, resilience, and unanswered questions. This is not a celebration of fame, but an exploration of the cost hidden behind the applause and the fragile human soul that stood beneath the crown. The story of Faye Dunaway is not simply the story of a woman who rose to fame and later struggled to maintain her place within an unforgiving industry. It is, at its core, a meditation on the collision between brilliance and isolation, between public worship and private loneliness, between artistic intensity and emotional vulnerability. Her life and career expose a deeper truth about Hollywood itself, that it often celebrates strength only when it remains comfortable and punishes those whose power cannot be easily controlled or softened. Faye Dunaway did not merely perform characters, she embodied a force that challenged expectations of femininity, obedience, and emotional restraint. And in doing so, she unknowingly stepped into a battle that would follow her long after the cameras stopped rolling. To the public, Faye Dunaway became a symbol of control, intelligence, and authority. She projected confidence so absolute that it seemed unbreakable. On screen, she was decisive, dominant, and fearless, commanding the narrative rather than reacting to it. Audiences believed this was who she truly was, a woman immune to doubt, untouched by insecurity, and armored against pain. But the truth was far more complex. Behind the poised exterior lived someone deeply sensitive, relentlessly self-critical, and driven by an almost painful need for perfection. The same emotional intensity that allowed her to deliver unforgettable performances also made her acutely vulnerable to rejection, misunderstanding, and emotional overload. While the world applauded the image, the woman behind it was fighting an internal war that few recognized and even fewer cared to understand. Faye Dunaway's journey reveals how fame can amplify inner conflict rather than resolve it. Success did not bring her peace. Instead, it raised the stakes of every failure, every disagreement, and every moment of vulnerability. As her reputation grew, so did the pressure to remain flawless, controlled, and endlessly exceptional. There was no room for exhaustion, mental strain, or emotional collapse. When cracks began to show, the industry did not respond with compassion, but with judgment. Behaviors rooted in anxiety, perfectionism, and emotional distress were reframed as arrogance or hostility. In this way, Faye Dunaway became both idolized and isolated, revered for her strength while being quietly punished for the very traits that made her great. At its deepest level, her story reflects the tragic contradiction of stardom itself. The public demands authenticity, yet punishes vulnerability. It celebrates intensity on screen, yet condemns it in real life. Faye Dunaway was praised for portraying powerful women, but offered little grace when she herself exhibited power, emotion, or resistance. Her struggle was not merely professional, it was existential. She was trapped between who she was expected to be and who she truly was, between the image of an untouchable icon and the reality of a woman navigating emotional fragility, personal isolation, and an industry growing increasingly intolerant of complexity. Ultimately, Faye Dunaway's story is not about failure, but about the cost of uncompromising individuality. It asks uncomfortable questions about how society treats those who refuse to dilute themselves, especially women who wield authority without apology. It challenges the myth that success heals all wounds and exposes the loneliness that can exist even at the highest levels of admiration. Her life stands as a quiet warning and a powerful reflection that being celebrated by millions does not protect a person from inner battles, and that sometimes the most admired figures are the ones fighting the hardest wars in silence. Faye Dunaway was born on January 14, 1941, in the small town of Bascom, Florida, far removed from the glamour and promise that would later define her public image. Her early life was shaped not by stability or ease, but by constant movement and emotional restraint. Her father, John Dunaway Jr., was a career officer in the United States Army, a profession that demanded discipline, order, and obedience above all else. His military service meant that the family relocated frequently, following assignments that uprooted Faye again and again during her formative years. Her mother, Grace April Smith Dunaway, was a homemaker for much of Faye's childhood and later worked as a bank clerk. She provided warmth and care, but within a household where structure and control often outweighed emotional expression. Growing up as an only child in this environment, Faye learned early how to exist within herself, developing an inward focus that would later become both her strength and her burden. The constant relocations left little room for lasting friendships or a sense of belonging. Each new town meant another school, another set of unfamiliar faces, and another quiet lesson in emotional self-reliance. While other children learned comfort through connection, Faye learned endurance through solitude. This transient upbringing instilled in her a deep awareness of impermanence and a need to maintain control over her inner world, since the outer one was always shifting. Her father's military discipline encouraged excellence and order, but also fostered emotional distance. Praise was earned, not freely given, and vulnerability was rarely rewarded. These early dynamics quietly shaped Faye's perfectionism and her intense sensitivity to criticism, traits that would later define both her artistry and her struggles. From a young age, Faye displayed an exceptional seriousness that set her apart from her peers. She gravitated toward music, particularly classical piano, and demonstrated a remarkable aptitude for it. Music became her first true refuge, a structured yet expressive outlet where discipline and emotion could coexist. She practiced relentlessly, approaching the piano with the same intensity that would later define her acting career. For a time, she even envisioned a future as a concert pianist, believing that music, not acting, would be her life's path. This early dedication revealed a defining pattern in Faye's personality. When she committed to something, she committed fully, demanding perfection not only from herself but from the world around her. Beneath her composure, however, lay a child deeply aware of emotional tension and unspoken expectations. The absence of siblings intensified her sense of observation, turning her into a watcher rather than a participant, someone who studied behavior and absorbed emotional undercurrents rather than expressing her own needs openly. This sensitivity, combined with her intelligence and discipline, created a complex inner life rich with imagination but vulnerable to emotional overload. Even in childhood, there was a quiet duality forming within her, a desire for approval and connection, counterbalanced by an instinct to protect herself through control and distance. These early years did not create a carefree dreamer destined for stardom, but rather a highly disciplined, emotionally complex individual shaped by structure, solitude, and unrelenting self-expectation. The roots of Faye Dunaway's later brilliance, intensity, and fragility can all be traced back to this foundational period. Her childhood did not teach her how to be at ease with the world, it taught her how to survive within it. And in many ways, that lesson would follow her for the rest of her life, influencing how she loved, how she worked, and how she ultimately struggled under the weight of her own extraordinary standards. Faye Dunaway's teenage years were not marked by ease, popularity, or effortless confidence, but by a quiet sense of being out of place, even as her intelligence and talent continued to grow. As the daughter of a military officer, she was still moving from place to place, never fully settling long enough to build a stable social identity. Each new school required her to start over, to observe before she spoke, and to measure herself against unfamiliar standards. While others formed cliques and friendships that lasted years, Faye learned to exist on the margins, aware of her difference but uncertain how to bridge it. This persistent feeling of being an outsider quietly fed a growing insecurity, one that would later manifest as both intense self-discipline and emotional guardedness. Physically, she did not yet resemble the commanding screen presence the world would later idolize. She was tall, serious, and reserved in an era that often rewarded cheerfulness and conformity. Her striking features, which would later be celebrated, made her feel conspicuous rather than admired. Confidence did not come naturally to her. It was constructed slowly, layer by layer, through achievement rather than affirmation. She was not the girl who effortlessly commanded attention in hallways or social gatherings. Instead, she was often overlooked, perceived as distant or intimidating, labels that masked her internal uncertainty and longing to belong. These experiences taught her early that visibility did not always equal acceptance, a lesson that would haunt her even at the height of fame. Emotionally, Faye struggled with a tension between her inner sensitivity and the disciplined environment in which she was raised. Expressing doubt or vulnerability felt unsafe, so she learned to internalize her fears and channel them into performance and preparation. School became a space where she could excel intellectually, even if she felt socially disconnected. She showed exceptional aptitude in academics and the arts, particularly music and literature, and these disciplines offered her a sense of control that social life did
That
not.
ever going to happen, but
Through piano practice,
I'm
reading,
really happy
and
to
study,
be here. I'm
she
always happy to
discovered
be
that mastery
at this
could
event
substitute
because
for belonging.
the Golden
If she could
Globe
not
has
be
always
loved
meant a great
easily,
deal to me.
she would be respected deeply. It was during these years that the first quiet sparks of artistic passion beyond music began to appear. School performances, recitations, and public presentations revealed her ability to hold attention when given structure and purpose. On stage, she felt less exposed than in everyday social interaction. Performance allowed her to inhabit emotion without having to explain herself, to be seen without being personally judged. This distinction was crucial. Acting, even in its earliest forms, gave her a controlled environment in which vulnerability became a tool rather than a weakness. Each performance reinforced the idea that discomfort could be transformed into power, that anxiety could sharpen focus rather than destroy it. Rejection and self-doubt did not crush Faye Dunaway during her teenage years. Instead, they hardened her resolve. She did not develop resilience through praise or popularity, but through the constant necessity to adapt, observe, and endure. Her confidence was not inherited or given freely, it was forged under pressure. These years taught her that talent alone was not enough, and that survival required preparation, control, and emotional restraint. The young girl who felt ordinary, overlooked, and uncertain was already learning how to transform inner tension into external precision. By the time she approached adulthood, Faye Dunaway was not yet a star, not even certain of her place in the world, but she had developed something far more enduring, an unyielding work ethic, a deep emotional reservoir, and an understanding that strength could be built from discomfort. These formative insecurities did not disappear as she grew older. They followed her into her career, fueling her intensity and perfectionism. The resilience that defined her success was not born from confidence, but from years of quietly learning how to stand alone, preparing her for a life that would demand extraordinary emotional endurance. Faye Dunaway's entry into the world of professional acting did not arrive with immediate certainty or effortless success. It was the result of years of discipline, risk, and a willingness to step into unfamiliar territory without guarantees. After initially pursuing classical music with the hope of becoming a concert pianist, she gradually realized that her deepest connection to expression lay not in performance alone, but in storytelling and emotional embodiment. This realization led her to study theater, first at the University of Florida and later at Boston University, before earning a place at the prestigious American National Theater and Academy in New York. There she was trained rigorously, surrounded by aspiring actors equally hungry and uncertain, all aware that talent alone rarely opened doors. For Faye Dunaway, this period was defined by humility, anxiety, and relentless self-examination. Her early professional years were marked by struggle rather than validation. She took on stage work and minor roles, absorbing criticism that was often blunt and unforgiving. Casting directors did not immediately see her as a star. Her intensity, seriousness, and unconventional beauty made her difficult to categorize. She was neither the approachable ingenue nor the easily marketable romantic lead. This ambiguity worked against her in an industry that preferred simplicity. Early auditions brought rejection more often than praise, and when opportunities did arise, they came with the pressure to prove herself quickly and completely. Each role felt like a test, not just of skill, but of worth. Her transition from stage to screen intensified these insecurities. Film acting required a different kind of vulnerability, one that exposed every hesitation and flaw under the unblinking eye of the camera. Faye was not immediately comfortable with this exposure. Early film appearances revealed a performer still learning how to translate theatrical intensity into cinematic restraint. Critics noted her promise, but also her rough edges. Rather than being discouraged, she responded with increased effort, studying her performances obsessively, adjusting, refining, and demanding more from herself than anyone else could. Growth for Faye Dunaway was born from discomfort and self-critique, not reassurance. The true turning point arrived when opportunity met preparation, when she was cast in a major role that finally allowed her intensity to exist without apology. The industry began to take notice. This was not a moment of instant transformation, but of recognition. Audiences saw a presence that was impossible to ignore, a woman who did not blend into the background or soften herself for acceptance. There was nervousness behind the scenes, a constant fear of being exposed as unworthy, but on screen she delivered with precision and force. Each scene became a declaration that she belonged, even if she still doubted it herself. What made Faye Dunaway's breakthrough distinctive was that it did not erase her vulnerability, it sharpened it. Early success did not bring comfort, but heightened awareness. She understood that fame was conditional and fleeting, and that survival required constant vigilance. Mistakes felt catastrophic, and praise felt temporary. Yet this very pressure fueled her ascent. She worked harder than her peers, prepared more intensely, and refused to approach any role casually. Embarrassment, criticism, and fear became her teachers, shaping a performer of rare focus and emotional depth. By the time she began to gain serious attention, Faye Dunaway was not an actress carried by luck or novelty. She was a product of persistence, discomfort, and hard-earned resilience. Her entry into fame was not a triumphant leap, but a cautious crossing, one step at a time, guided by determination rather than confidence. This vulnerability, hidden beneath her growing authority on screen, would become both the source of her greatest performances and the seed of future conflict, as success amplified not only her talent, but her inner tension as well. Faye Dunaway's golden era is a study in how raw talent, relentless determination, and distinctive intensity can converge to create an enduring icon. By the late 1960s and early 1970s, Faye had transitioned from promising newcomer to one of Hollywood's most compelling leading actresses, a period in which her name became synonymous with both critical acclaim and cultural significance. Her ascent was not gradual or understated. It arrived with a series of performances that demanded attention, reshaped audience expectations, and defined a generation of cinematic storytelling. Her presence on screen was magnetic, commanding both admiration and respect, and her choices in roles reflected a sophisticated understanding of character, narrative, and impact. It was the role of Bonnie Parker in Bonnie and Clyde, 1967, that first announced Faye Dunaway as a force to be reckoned with. The film itself was revolutionary, a departure from conventional storytelling and an emblem of a new era in Hollywood, often referred to as the New Hollywood movement. Faye's performance embodied a complex mixture of vulnerability, rebellion, sensuality, and toughness. Critics were quick to praise the depth she brought to Bonnie, noting her ability to inhabit a character who was at once charismatic and morally ambiguous. Her chemistry with co-star Warren Beatty was electric, capturing the imagination of audiences worldwide and redefining what it meant to be a leading actress. She was no longer simply beautiful or glamorous, she was a performer of extraordinary range and emotional authenticity. Following Bonnie and Clyde, Faye Dunaway's career entered an unrelenting period of high-profile projects and critical acclaim. She took on roles that required daring, sophistication, and emotional complexity. Films like The Thomas Crown Affair, 1968, and Little Big Man, 1970, showcased her ability to oscillate between sensuality and intellectual rigor, playfulness and gravitas. She became known for portraying women who were both alluring and formidable, characters who demanded that audiences reckon with their presence. In a Hollywood still dominated by male-driven narratives, Faye created a space for nuanced female power, one that was both admired and feared, celebrated and critiqued. Her performances were more than acting, they were cultural statements, redefining femininity and authority on screen. Awards and recognition quickly followed, cementing her status as one of the most influential actresses of her time. She won the Academy Award for Best Actress in her riveting performance in Network, 1976, where she played Diana Christensen, a ruthless television executive whose ambition and intensity mirrored both societal critique and cinematic mastery. In Network, Faye Dunaway captured the zeitgeist of an era obsessed with media, spectacle, and the intersection of morality and ambition. Her performance was layered, fearless, and incisive, earning her not only the highest accolades in the film industry, but also the enduring respect of critics and peers alike. This was not merely stardom, it was cultural authority. She was shaping dialogue, challenging expectations, and creating moments that would be studied, celebrated, and emulated for decades. During this period, Faye Dunaway became nearly omnipresent in both cinema and public consciousness. She was a fixture on magazine covers, talk shows, and award ceremonies, a symbol of elegance and intelligence, capable of commanding attention with a single glance. Her impact went beyond the screen. She influenced fashion, public discourse, and the very perception of female agency in film. Directors and writers sought her out, knowing that her presence could elevate a project, attract audiences, and imbue even a flawed narrative with credibility. To watch Faye Dunaway in this era was to witness mastery born of preparation, instinct, and emotional acuity. She was at once celebrated for her beauty and revered for her craft, a combination that created a near mythical aura. Yet, even at the peak of her power, the demands of fame were exacting. The relentless scrutiny of both media and industry began to weigh heavily. Every performance was analyzed, every public appearance dissected, and every choice questioned. Faye Dunaway's intensity, once a source of brilliance on screen, occasionally became a source of tension off-screen. Directors praised her dedication, but also found her exacting and unyielding. Colleagues admired her discipline, but sometimes struggled with her uncompromising standards. The very traits that propelled her to greatness, focus, passion, and a refusal to settle for mediocrity, also contributed to moments of isolation, pressure, and professional friction. Even during her golden era, the duality of triumph and personal cost was becoming apparent, a tension that would later define her public and private life. Despite these pressures, Faye Dunaway's golden era remains a testament to the heights of achievement and influence a performer can reach. She was a woman who redefined what it meant to command a screen, to merge intellect and allure, to be both admired and formidable. Her roles, from Bonnie Parker to Diana Christensen, were more than entertainment. They were declarations of capability, audacity, and vision. This was a period in which audiences could not ignore her, could not stop discussing her, and could not fail to be affected by her artistry. She became a standard by which other actors were measured, a reference point in both popular culture and cinematic history. It is crucial to recognize that Faye Dunaway's golden era was not simply the accumulation of awards and box office successes. It was a demonstration of the transformative power of resilience, talent, and unwavering commitment to craft. Every performance carried the weight of her preparation, the echoes of her formative insecurities, and the intensity honed through years of discipline. In this sense, her golden era was both triumphant and fragile, a brilliant apex built on meticulous effort, emotional depth, and an unyielding desire to prove herself not merely as a woman in Hollywood, but as an artist capable of defining an era. Even at the pinnacle of her career, Faye Dunaway's golden era was not without its shadows. While audiences saw perfection, charisma, and control, beneath the surface there were early signs that the pressures of fame, the relentless scrutiny of Hollywood, and the impossible standards of success were slowly eroding her equilibrium. This period is crucial to understanding that no ascent, no matter how dazzling, is ever without compromise or unseen struggle. Faye's brilliance on screen coexisted with mounting professional, social, and emotional tensions that foreshadowed challenges that would come to define much of her later life. In the late 1960s and 1970s, Hollywood was a notoriously high-pressure environment, particularly for women. Faye Dunaway, with her striking features, sharp intellect, and uncompromising approach to acting, stood out in an industry that often sought to confine women to decorative roles or predictable archetypes. Her intensity made her magnetic on camera, yet off-screen it frequently translated into friction. Directors praised her commitment to perfection, but sometimes grew frustrated with her assertiveness or refusal to yield to compromises she felt undermined the authenticity of her work. Agents, publicists, and journalists lauded her accomplishments, yet the constant media scrutiny, the endless photo shoots, the probing interviews, the speculation over her personal life created an environment where privacy became a luxury she could not afford. The very visibility that brought her fame was simultaneously a crucible in which anxiety and isolation began to take hold. The physical and mental toll of sustained success was significant. The schedules were punishing: long shooting days, international travel, promotional events, and award ceremonies left little room for rest or personal reflection. Faye Dunaway had an extraordinary work ethic, often immersing herself entirely in a role, yet this level of commitment left her vulnerable to exhaustion and emotional burnout. Friends and colleagues would later describe periods when she seemed distant or emotionally frayed, moments when the public face of confidence and poise clashed sharply with private vulnerability. While she never publicly acknowledged these strains during her rise, subtle signs, occasional tension on set, reported conflicts with co-stars or directors, and an intensity that could overwhelm collaborators hinted at the emotional price of maintaining such a high level of performance under constant observation. Simultaneously, the demands on her image began to feel confining. As a leading actress and style icon, Faye was expected to uphold an aesthetic ideal: elegance, beauty, and sophistication at all times. From award shows to film premieres, every detail of appearance was scrutinized, every gesture analyzed. Even minor lapses were exaggerated in the press, creating a perpetual tension between personal comfort and public expectation. This constant attention to outward perfection reinforced the internal pressure to maintain control not only over her career, but also her self-presentation. Behind the polished exterior, the relentless awareness of the world's gaze created a subtle, accumulating stress, a persistent reminder that failure or imperfection, even fleeting, could have public consequences. The emotional isolation that often accompanies fame began to manifest as well. As Faye rose higher in Hollywood, genuine friendships became increasingly difficult to maintain. Colleagues were frequently competitors, relationships were subject to rumor and scrutiny, trust was always fragile. While she was admired and respected, deep, dependable personal connections were often overshadowed by professional obligations or jealousy. Even moments of personal joy could be tempered by the intrusion of the media or the impossibility of separating public persona from private life. It was a paradox. She was surrounded by people, yet profoundly alone in the responsibility and scrutiny that fame demanded. Another subtle but significant factor was the pressure to constantly evolve and challenge herself artistically. Faye Dunaway was never content with repeating past successes. She sought roles that would stretch her range and redefine her career. This relentless pursuit of artistic growth, while laudable, introduced additional strain. Every character she took on required emotional intensity, physical preparation, and psychological investment. Roles such as Joan Crawford in Mommy E. Jean or Diana Christensen in Network demanded extraordinary immersion, often leaving her physically and emotionally drained. Even when these performances were celebrated, the exertion required left lingering fatigue and an undercurrent of vulnerability, an early crack in the armor of her seemingly unshakable star power. It is also worth noting the early interplay between personal and professional life during this period. Relationships, both romantic and platonic, were complicated by her career demands. Lovers often struggled to balance their own ambitions with the realities of Faye's life in Hollywood, while friends occasionally felt alienated by the constant public attention she received. While these pressures were not catastrophic at the time, they laid the groundwork for future emotional turbulence. They created a subtle narrative of tension between achievement and intimacy, public adulation and private solitude, that would resonate through the more visible struggles of her later years. By the end of the 1970s, Faye Dunaway had achieved a level of fame that few could imagine, yet the cracks in her world were becoming increasingly visible to those close to her. These were not dramatic collapses or scandals, but the quiet accumulation of stress, exhaustion, and emotional strain that often accompanies life at the pinnacle. They served as a harbinger of the challenges that would later test not just her career, but her personal resilience, mental health, and relationships. In sum, Faye Dunaway's golden era, while dazzling and transformative, was interwoven with hidden fractures. She was at once the embodiment of perfection, control, and talent, yet beneath that exterior lay the subtle accumulating pressures of fame, relentless expectation, and emotional isolation. These cracks were not immediately visible to the public, but they were real, foreshadowing the more overt struggles that would later define aspects of her personal life. In this way, the story of Faye Dunaway's ascent is as much about the brilliance of her achievements as it is about the vulnerability that even the brightest stars carry behind the glare of the spotlight. As Faye Dunaway's career soared to remarkable heights, the glare of Hollywood's spotlight illuminated not only her professional triumphs, but also the intricate, often turbulent landscape of her personal life. For someone who thrived on control, intensity, and perfection on screen, navigating relationships off-screen proved to be equally complex, fraught with passion, misunderstandings, and at times profound heartbreak. Her personal connections, romantic, familial, and platonic, would come to play a pivotal role in shaping the narrative of her life, illustrating how fame, artistry, and emotion can intersect in both extraordinary and destabilizing ways. Faye Dunaway's romantic life has long been the subject of public fascination, partly because of the intensity with which she approached love, and partly because the media often sensationalized her relationships. Early in her career, as she moved from Broadway into Hollywood, she experienced both fleeting romances and intense, transformative connections. These relationships were not mere footnotes, they were integral to her emotional development and understanding of intimacy. Friends and biographers alike describe Faye as someone who loved deeply and passionately, who sought a partner capable of matching her intensity, intellect, and ambition. Yet this very desire for a profound connection often led to mismatched dynamics, misunderstandings, and emotional friction. One of her earliest notable relationships was with actor Richard Burton. Though the public knew Burton for his flamboyant lifestyle and tumultuous romantic history, Faye's connection with him was reportedly grounded in mutual admiration for artistry and intellect. Friends observed that she was drawn to men who shared her intensity, but such relationships often demanded an emotional bandwidth that even the strongest individuals could struggle to sustain. The romance, while stimulating and enriching, ultimately reflected the tension between Faye's desire for connection and the external pressures of fame and public scrutiny, which could strain even the most promising unions. During the peak of her cinematic achievements in the 1970s, Faye engaged in a series of high-profile relationships, including with fellow actors and creative partners. Each relationship carried with it the weight of expectation, both personal and public. Hollywood at the time thrived on gossip, speculation, and the relentless exposure of stars' private lives. A dinner date, a shared project, or a public appearance could easily become fodder for the tabloids, magnifying any small conflict into a perceived scandal. For Faye, whose professional identity was built on precision and control, the intrusion of public opinion into her private affairs created constant emotional pressure. Her relationships were not simply about love, they were negotiations between personal desire and the unyielding gaze of the audience. Marriage, however, proved to be particularly challenging. Though Faye never settled into long-term unions in the way some of her contemporaries
that are ever
did,
going to happen. But
each romantic involvement
I'm really
carried
happy to
lessons
be
of
here. I'm always
intensity,
happy to be
compromise,
at this
and at
event
times
because
betrayal.
the Golden
Her
Globe
partners
has
often
always meant a
admired
great
her
deal to me.
independence, creativity, and strength, yet these same qualities could intimidate or unsettle those who sought a more conventional dynamic. Reports and interviews over the decades suggest that Faye sometimes experienced profound disillusionment when a partner could not reconcile her professional life with the personal connection she required. This mismatch between expectation and reality was a recurring theme, underscoring that even a woman at the apex of success could encounter emotional turbulence that fame could not mitigate. Friendships, too, were deeply affected by the pressures of her career. Hollywood's social ecosystem is notoriously competitive, where alliances can be as temporary as the next film role. Faye, known for her exacting standards and uncompromising approach to her craft, sometimes experienced friction with peers. Though she maintained a close circle of confidants, these relationships required careful navigation. Misunderstandings, envy, or professional rivalry could strain bonds, adding to the isolation that often accompanies high achievement. Behind the scenes, even routine interactions were imbued with the intensity that characterized her personality, reflecting both her brilliance and the emotional vigilance that fame demanded. Family connections, particularly with siblings and extended relatives, also had their complexities. While she was devoted to her family in private, her relentless professional schedule often limited the depth of sustained interaction. Letters, phone calls, and rare visits formed the backbone of her connection, yet the distance imposed by career commitments sometimes magnified feelings of separation. Family, who might have offered grounding, instead became a balancing act between obligation and personal need. This constant negotiation between professional demands and personal loyalty became a recurring theme in her life, foreshadowing the broader emotional trials she would face later. Perhaps most notably, her relationships often reflected a paradox of intimacy. She sought emotional closeness, yet the very intensity of her persona sometimes created barriers. Loved ones marveled at her charisma, intelligence, and emotional depth, but sustaining connection with someone whose life was lived so publicly and so passionately required extraordinary patience and understanding. As she later reflected in interviews, this tension was not a simple matter of compatibility. It was the inherent challenge of being a woman of exceptional talent, visible to the world, and yet deeply human beneath the carefully curated exterior. Romantic entanglements, friendships, and family ties all played a formative role in shaping Faye's inner life, influencing both her creative output and her emotional well-being. Each relationship brought lessons, joys, and heartbreaks, contributing to her growing awareness of the cost of fame and the delicate balance between personal fulfillment and professional ambition. These experiences illuminated the fragile equilibrium she maintained between the dazzling successes of her career and the emotional vulnerabilities that lurked beneath the surface. Ultimately, Faye Dunaway's personal life in these years serves as a critical bridge between her professional accomplishments and the later challenges that would define her narrative. By examining the interplay between love, friendship, and personal struggle, we gain insight into the human complexities that accompanied her stardom. These relationships were not mere tabloid fodder, they were integral to understanding how a woman of extraordinary talent could be simultaneously celebrated and profoundly tested, adored by millions while navigating the labyrinth of human connection, desire, and betrayal. In the next stage, the story moves to the major turning points in Faye's life, including pivotal betrayals, public humiliations, or events that caused her personal and emotional foundation to tremble, a point where the cracks she had felt for years became more visible to the outside world. For Faye Dunaway, the apex of fame and the intensity of her personal relationships eventually converged into moments of profound personal crisis, a juncture where the illusions of stability and control were dramatically disrupted. While her professional achievements and public admiration seemed unassailable, the private sphere of her life revealed vulnerabilities that fame alone could neither shield nor compensate. The major turning points in Faye's emotional journey were not single catastrophic events, but a series of interconnected ruptures that collectively redefined her inner world, her perspective on trust, and her relationship with herself and those she loved. One of the earliest and most significant turning points came in the realm of romantic entanglements, where the passionate intensity that had often fueled her connections became a source of deep emotional upheaval. During the height of her career in the 1970s, Faye was romantically linked to several high-profile figures, and each of these relationships carried both exhilaration and risk. One particularly publicized romance, often scrutinized by the media, ended in a sense of betrayal that pierced deeply, highlighting the precarious balance between love and career, intimacy and public performance. For Faye, the pain of these experiences was compounded by the knowledge that the world would watch, judge, and interpret her vulnerability as weakness or scandal. Another critical turning point emerged from professional betrayals and conflicts within the entertainment industry itself. While Faye Dunaway had earned acclaim for her acting prowess, earning Oscars and critical praise, the competitive and sometimes cutthroat environment of Hollywood repeatedly tested her resilience. There were instances where colleagues or producers undermined her, projects faltered despite her best efforts, or roles she believed suited her talent were reallocated or criticized harshly. These professional disappointments were more than mere career setbacks. They struck at the core of her identity, intertwining personal pride with professional validation. When such disappointments coincided with strained personal relationships, Faye's emotional equilibrium was profoundly challenged, marking a phase where both her public and private worlds felt unstable. A particularly significant turning point occurred with her highly publicized relationship struggles in the 1980s and 90s, including broken engagements and complex romantic liaisons. Unlike fleeting early romances, these relationships were invested with long-term hopes, plans, and emotional labor. Yet the outcomes were often disappointing, sometimes abrupt, and occasionally tinged with betrayal. Friends and observers noted that Faye approached relationships with a sense of seriousness and intensity that demanded equal commitment from her partners. When expectations were not met or when trust was fractured, the emotional consequences were magnified. These ruptures were not merely private sorrows, they reverberated through her work, her public persona, and her inner sense of stability, amplifying a growing awareness that personal happiness and professional achievement were not always mutually compatible. The pressures of media scrutiny intensified the impact of these turning points. Every romantic split, every rumored conflict was dissected by tabloids and entertainment news outlets. The public, fascinated by her image of glamour and composure, often projected narratives onto her life that bore little resemblance to the truth. For Faye, this external gaze created a dual burden. The private pain of emotional rupture was compounded by the necessity of maintaining public grace. The discrepancy between the internal chaos and the external poise became a defining tension, a fracture in her personal foundation that left lasting effects on her psychological landscape. It was also during these periods that Faye confronted the paradox of fame. The very qualities that had propelled her to the highest echelons of Hollywood, intensity, passion, and a relentless pursuit of excellence, could also isolate her from the human connections she craved. Friends and confidants observed that she often oscillated between periods of openness and guardedness, between deep engagement with loved ones and retreat into solitude. The turning points were less about dramatic public incidents and more about the cumulative emotional weight of repeated disappointment, misalignment of expectations, and a profound sense of vulnerability that few could witness or understand. Family dynamics also contributed to this phase of emotional vulnerability. While Faye remained committed to familial relationships, the intense demands of her career meant that she was often physically and emotionally distant from relatives. Missed milestones, deferred family obligations, and the constant pull of professional responsibilities created subtle, ongoing fractures in her closest connections. These relational gaps, when combined with romantic disappointments and professional betrayals, created a perfect storm in which Faye's emotional foundation felt increasingly precarious, setting the stage for a period of personal struggle and reflection. In summary, the major turning point in Faye Dunaway's life was defined not by a single dramatic incident, but by the convergence of personal, professional, and emotional ruptures. Romantic betrayals, unmet expectations, industry conflicts, and relentless public scrutiny coalesced into a profound challenge to her sense of identity and security. This phase marked a departure from the earlier equilibrium she had managed to maintain between talent, ambition, and relationships. For Faye, it was a period of realization that no amount of fame or professional success could insulate her from the vulnerability and unpredictability of the human heart. The significance of this turning point extends beyond mere biography. It illustrates the delicate interplay between brilliance and fragility, between the cultivated exterior of success and the deeply human need for trust, love, and validation. It's the moment where Faye's story shifts from the triumphs of achievement to the exploration of resilience, introspection, and the slow, painstaking process of reclaiming stability after profound emotional upheaval. The cracks that formed here would later inform her struggles with identity, well-being, and the pursuit of personal peace, serving as the pivot point from which her journey into challenge, recovery, and reflection would unfold. Following the major turning points in Faye Dunaway's life, the betrayals, broken relationships, and professional disappointments, she entered a period often described as her most challenging and tumultuous. While Faye's public image remained that of a consummate professional, admired for her talent, elegance, and on-screen intensity, her private life told a far more complex story. Behind the red carpet appearances and critically acclaimed performances, she grappled with the kind of inner turmoil that can destabilize even the most seemingly resilient individual. This downward spiral was neither sudden nor sensationalized. Rather, it was a gradual unraveling, a convergence of personal grief, emotional fatigue, and the pressures of a relentless career. During this period, Faye confronted a multifaceted struggle that included mental health challenges, coping mechanisms that sometimes veered into self-destructive behaviors, and moments of public scrutiny that magnified her vulnerabilities. Mental health, often overlooked in the Hollywood context of her time, played a central role. Faye herself, in interviews later in life, acknowledged periods of profound anxiety, depression, and emotional fatigue, states exacerbated by the relentless demands of maintaining her celebrity image. The tension between performing at the highest level and managing personal distress created a persistent pressure cooker, where small setbacks could ignite larger crises. Part of this downward spiral involved periods of isolation. Faye, known for her intensity and passionate approach to both work and relationships, sometimes found it difficult to trust others fully, particularly after experiences of betrayal. This led to cycles of withdrawal from friends, family, and even colleagues who might have offered support. Solitude, while occasionally a source of reflection and artistic focus, increasingly became a double-edged sword, reinforcing feelings of loneliness and emotional disconnection. The very traits that contributed to her extraordinary presence on screen, her focus, her perfectionism, her capacity for deep emotional expression, also rendered her more vulnerable when the structures of support faltered. Addiction, both to substances and to coping strategies, became a recurring theme during this turbulent period. Though Faye never faced the publicized substance scandals that plagued some of her contemporaries, accounts suggest that she occasionally relied on alcohol or prescription medications to manage the stress, anxiety, and insomnia that accompanied her lifestyle. These coping mechanisms were not constant, but their intermittent use underscored the fragility of her mental equilibrium and highlighted the universal struggle of attempting to maintain control when one's emotional foundation is compromised. It was a period where the boundaries between professional obligation and personal well-being blurred, creating a vicious cycle in which work stress fed into personal distress and vice versa. Public perception during this phase amplified the downward spiral. The media, often insensitive to the nuance of mental health, sometimes framed Faye's challenges as eccentricity, volatility, or even scandal. A few high-profile incidents, disagreements on set, highly publicized personality clashes, or moments of visible emotional strain were magnified in the press, creating a perception of instability. For someone like Faye, who had spent decades building an image of control, poise, and artistic brilliance, the weight of public scrutiny was acutely painful. She had to navigate the dual burden of internal struggle and external judgment, a combination that intensified the downward trajectory. Professional setbacks also contributed to the spiral. Projects she had hoped would solidify her position sometimes faltered, were critically panned, or became embroiled in controversy. Directors and producers occasionally criticized her methods, misunderstood her artistic intentions, or questioned her reliability, judgments made harsher because of the public perception of her difficult personality. Even the most talented actors are subject to professional vicissitudes, but for Faye, the intersection of personal vulnerability and public expectation created a uniquely punishing environment. These moments, combined with private heartbreak and isolation, deepened the emotional and psychological challenges she faced. The downward spiral also manifested in social and interpersonal difficulties. Friendships strained under the weight of emotional volatility, and romantic relationships became more tentative and fraught with mistrust. Faye's intensity, once an asset, could now alienate those closest to her, creating a feedback loop in which loneliness and emotional pain reinforced each other. It was a period of heightened sensitivity, where perceived slights or betrayals could trigger disproportionate distress, and yet the very qualities that made her exceptional as an actress, her emotional range, her fearlessness in confronting human vulnerability, were inseparable from the struggles she faced in life. Despite these challenges, it is crucial to approach this period with empathy rather than sensationalism. Faye Dunaway's downward spiral was not a story of failure, but of human complexity. She navigated mental health struggles, periods of isolation, coping through imperfect means, and the relentless pressures of public and professional life, all while maintaining a remarkable career and continuing to deliver performances that captivated audiences. This period reflects a universal truth that personal suffering often occurs in parallel with achievement, and that the path to resilience is rarely linear or free of setbacks. Ultimately, the downward spiral laid bare the stark contrast between Faye's public persona and private reality. While audiences saw a poised, controlled, and commanding figure on screen, behind closed doors, she faced the fragility, anxiety, and emotional intensity that accompany human life regardless of fame or accolade. This phase of her journey would set the stage for the eventual emergence of an anchor, a stabilizing presence in her life that allowed Faye to begin reclaiming balance, perspective, and hope. It was a testament to the resilience required to endure the convergence of personal heartbreak, professional pressure, and public scrutiny. In essence, this period illustrates the universality of human vulnerability, the hidden costs of fame, and the difficult, often invisible struggle of maintaining identity and stability in the face of relentless external and internal pressures. For Faye Dunaway, the downward spiral was not merely a chapter of decline, it was a crucible, a demanding period that tested the limits of her endurance, emotional insight, and capacity for self-recovery. It is a reminder that even the brightest stars must navigate darkness, and that resilience often emerges from the very depths of struggle, a theme that would define the next chapters of her life.